Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks using the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. James Leach is a PhD candidate at Carnegie Mellon University. James, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
You're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes. What is it you're researching and writing about?
I am working on my dissertation in the history department, tentatively titled, I think I must have gone through a few different titles at this point, but tentatively titled Training the Brain in 20th Century America. It's a history of social science. It's a history focused on social science research on aging and elderly people's cognitive decline, if cognitive decline occurs, and its application in corporate retirement practice and age-based anti-discrimination law.
Wow, that's really interesting. What time period are you looking at? Do you also perhaps have a spatial setting?
Yes, I'm focused on the United States after World War II. This research is relevant to a lot of different countries, and it does cross national borders, but the United States is really unique among wealthy countries in a lot of ways in that it's almost entirely banned mandatory retirement as a practice, especially after 1986, when the Age Discrimination in Employment Act was amended to make mandatory retirement illegal, except in a few very specific cases. So it's really stretching from the end of World War II, when the issue of America's aging population and aging workforce really becomes a national issue, up until this point in the 80s, when it's decided that forcing people to retire when they reach 65 is a form of discrimination and should be illegal in most cases.
Well, what are some of your sources to tell this story?
A lot of my sources are from the social sciences. So in some ways, I'm lucky that I can rely on published sources on the scientific studies that sociologists and especially psychologists have performed on elderly people. I'm really interested in things like their choice of how to measure decline. So in psychologists' case, typically this is done with intelligence tests, and they might choose different sorts of tests to test different parts of the mind or different conceptions of what it means to decline over time. And I'm lucky that a lot of those sources are publicly available. I did do some research at the Hagley Center this past spring with an exploratory grant. I got a chance to look through, because the focus is really on the social science, but I'm interested in how it's applied. So I got a chance to look through the Seagram company's records just to get a sense of what a large corporation in the middle of the 20th century, what their retirement practices are. Do they have mandatory retirement? Do they rely on outside expert knowledge to make these decisions on who should be retired? Those sorts of questions.
Well, and what did retirement look like within Seagram's in this mid-20th century period you're looking at?
So what you often hear when you're reading about this period is this was the era of mandatory retirement, when it was very common in major corporations to force people to retire once they reached 65. And that was basically the case at Seagram's, but it was a little bit more complicated. Retirement practices were somewhat flexible, and there were different standards for different kinds of employees. So their major reorganization was in 1957, I believe, when they introduced a new pension system and took that chance to reorganize the retirement practice. For executives in the company, There was mandatory retirement at 65. For other employees, the language that they use is quite interesting. They talk about employees are expected to retire at 65, or we hope that employees will retire at 65, but in reality it was flexible. Employees could, with the permission of their supervisor, choose to work later than that. They could choose to retire earlier. And these all had implications for their pensions after retirement, of course. And the other wrench that gets thrown into the system, I guess you could say, is married women were coming out of World War II, were allowed to work on the same retirement schedule as men. But the practice was expected that married women, unless they had a husband in the army, shouldn't be working. So they made their decision to return to the pre-war practice of essentially firing their married women employees. So it's a very disparate, heterogeneous system of retirement.
Hmm. What was the company's stake in forcing retirement at 65? Was it directly based on the assumption that cognitive decline follows thereafter, or was there another, perhaps a pecuniary reasoning behind that decision or that practice?
Yeah, I find it's a difficult question to answer because the sources don't always say what we want them to say, and as you said, there's the pecuniary incentive, and people are less likely to be upfront about that sort of thing. I will say that there is less focus on cognitive decline than I'll say in my research, starting from the social scientists, we find that these people prepare a lot of tools for use for employers, saying, here are these ways that you can tell whether your older employees are still fit to work. Here are the sorts of tests that you can use. Here are the sorts of maybe you could call them algorithms for determining, based on what a person's physical and mental health is at this age, this is probably how long they'll be able to continue to work. And a company like Seagram's, I find, didn't really use these tools. I think when they talk about retiring an employee because of their failing health, whether that's psychological or physical, that decision is usually made by a physician, which is a sort of private one-on-one evaluation that's hard to get at in the historical sources. But to your main question, I do suspect that the pecuniary element of it did play a large role, that this was as much about keeping the pension system in order, making sure that they wanted to continue to hire young people, especially for these executive positions, these positions where there was that hard mandatory retirement limit. They wanted to make their company attractive to college graduates, young engineers, and that meant sort of clearing out the older executive class and making room for new hires.
Mm-hmm. What were some of these sociological tools being developed for what it really sounds like is analyzing and even grading and categorizing human capital, as it were, the labor pool within a company?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the historical basis for a lot of these tools is the explosion of personnel research and personnel departments in the early part of the 20th century. And this, I can say, my background approaching this topic is largely in the history of science and the history of education. So I'm very interested in intelligence tests and psychometrics, which first become these popular tools in the Army in World War I, and then in public schools, and then in businesses for hiring. but all these settings where people want to sort and evaluate young people. And then the question becomes, as the workforce gets older, as these questions of retirement and retirement benefits and social security and who should be given how these financial resources should be distributed, there's a question of whether these tools initially developed for young people can be applied to older people. And people have to ask all these questions about, how do these tests need to change as we move from young people to old people, where tests for young people are usually timed and you have to complete the sets in a set amount of time, but is that fair to older people who might be just as skilled as young people, but might need a bit more time to come to the right answer?
It seems to me the big historical context for this is in this mid 20th century moment where all of a sudden retirement benefits and social security, as you mentioned, are an expectation for a large proportion of the workforce for the first time in a really historically novel way. Could you perhaps unpack that a little bit about companies having to deal with retirement because that is now the expectation of society, that workers will be able to retire with some financial security?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So going back to the early history of Social Security, one of the social scientists who helped promote the Social Security Act in 1935, one of these, I believe he was trained as an economist, but Abraham Epstein did research on the elderly and the elderly in the workforce during the 1920s and 1930s, when sort of the accepted framing of this as a social problem was poverty among the elderly. And his framing was that as the Industrial Revolution accelerated and employment became much more mechanized and corporatized, this older world where older people could continue and work as long as they were able, and maybe they weren't able to contribute as much as young people, but that's all right, they can still contribute some, started to fall apart because if elder people aren't able to keep up with this new industrial pace, then there's just no place for them in work. And so his solution to that is we need to, now that older people are no longer able to work in this economy, we have a responsibility to provide for them. And that's sort of the social science justification for Social Security. And from the employer's perspective, there's this assumption that older workers are not as valuable as younger workers. Maybe they don't work as hard or in the same way, or maybe it takes more time to teach them new skills. And so the assumption is that Social Security, which seems to be an imposition on employers, a drain. Now they're required to, I'm saying Social Security, but also these pension systems, retirement, providing for employees after they've left the workforce. The employers start to see maybe this can be helpful in some ways by clearing out these older employees, making room for younger hires, providing those younger hires incentive to stay at the same company for a long period of time because they know there will be this ladder of promotion, especially in these sort of highly sought after executive positions, which are of course restricted mostly to men and to white men. But the system of mandatory retirement sort of is applied much broader than that.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering whether your study has implications for the present day, where we have an aging population overall, and as well as older folks staying in the workforce much longer. The context of which, of course, being the erosion of some of these retirement benefits, both public and private systems. So
Mm.
does your study perhaps speak to the present moment in some way?
I think it does. I think what we've seen in France since the beginning of this year really points to some of the national differences in how different countries handle retirement and mandatory retirement. I think it'd be too much of a cop out to say, well, certainly this is going to be applicable to the present, but I'll see how applicable it is when I get to the end. That's my instinct to say that. Um, I think that um, there's this narrative that seemed to hold true for a long time that someone like Abraham Epstein was promoting, that poverty among the elderly was a problem at one point, but now we've moved past that. Now we're living in the mid 20th century, this time of affluence when um, pensions and Social Security and Medicare are able to provide for the elderly, and lift them out of poverty. But I think that that poverty among the elderly, or if not even poverty, then financial hardship among the elderly, uh, does have historical roots. Certainly before Social Security, I think even during the Social Security era, and so I do think that there is a lot of context for an aging workforce that's still relevant today.
Well, James, thanks for taking the time to share your work with me. It's really interesting.
Thank you. It's been great to talk about it.
Oh, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.